So I'm Mimi Bao, for those of you who don't know me. I work here for DU for the Pioneer Leadership Program. And we have the special privilege to hear from Billy Shore, the founder and CEO of Share Our Strength, which works to end children's hunger in the United States. It's a national nonprofit, and it's based in DC. So I first heard about Billy when I was in business school over at Daniels, and we read an excerpt of his book, The Cathedral Within, and it changed my life. So I'm really excited that he's here. Realize the beauty in what we call social enterprise, uniting the business efficiencies of corporations with the social good component of nonprofits. So the progress in ending children's hunger that Share Our Strength has made due to creativity and partnerships is outstanding. So that's why I'm personally really excited that he's here. He's an idol of mine, an incredible inspiration. So I want to share a little bit about him specifically. He founded Share Our Strength in 1984 with his sister Debbie, and with a $2,000 cash advance on a credit card. And since then, Share Our Strength has raised and invested more than $600 million in the fight against hunger, and has won the support of national leaders in business, government, health, education, sports, and entertainment. Billy is also the chairman of Community Wealth Partners, a Share Our Strength organization that helps change agents solve social problems at the magnitude they exist. Bill is the author of 4 books focused on social change, including Revolution of the Heart, The Cathedral Within, The Light of Conscience, and most recently, The Imaginations of Unreasonable Men. A native of Pittsburgh, Bill earned a BA at the University of Pennsylvania and his law degree from George Washington University in DC. He's been an adjunct professor at NYU Stern School of Business and an advisor for the Reynolds Foundation Fellowship Program at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. From 2001 to 2011, he served as a director of the Timberland Company. Bill was named one of America's best leaders in 2005 by U.S. News World Report. And in 2011, the Jefferson Awards Foundation presented Bill with the S. Roger Horchow Award for Greatest Public Service. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Billy Shore.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mimi. Great to see everybody here. Thank you for having me. That was a lovely introduction. That was worth flying here for. Love to hear those. I want to thank David Miller from the Institute of Philanthropy and Social Enterprise. That's another reason I'm here, is because nobody says no to David Miller, and I never have and never will, and I'm very excited about the institute that's coming together here at the university. And excited to meet all of you because of your interest in this, and because every time I go to a school, I learn something important. I was just, well, I'll give you an example. I was just at my son's school. He's a 6th grader. Leave aside for a moment the improbability of my having a 6th grader, but he's a 6th grader, and his teacher, Mr. Horowitz, invited me to come to class to talk about our work at Share Our Strength. And I said yes before realizing that this would make it the most embarrassing day of Nate's life. I don't know, your parents don't embarrass you anymore, right? You're past that? Okay. Well, yeah, for Nate this was brutal. And the reason I knew this was going to be bad was he woke up that morning and he walked out of his bedroom. Before he even rubbed out the sleep out of his eyes, he looked at me and he said, "Tell me you're not wearing that shirt," which was like this shirt. It was just like a blue shirt. I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, Dad." He said, "Do me one favor, just promise me before you walk into class, you'll stop in the hall, you'll take your 2 fingers and you'll rub down your eyebrows. Sometimes they go every which way." It's like, okay, this is something I didn't know before. And then he said, "There's one other thing." He said, "Just listen really, really carefully when the kids ask you a question." He said, "I don't know if it's because you're an older parent, but I've observed that sometimes when I say thank you, you say, 'I love you too.'" He said, "So I'm not really sure if you're listening carefully." So I said, "Okay." I said, "Besides all this wonderful cosmetic advice, do you have any substantive tips on how I can connect with your classmates?" And he said no, because I thought this was a terrible idea the first time I heard it. The reason I tell you about Nate's school, though, is for me, some really valuable things came out of it. And one of those things was a young boy, as I was another 6th grader, as I was talking, he raised his hand and he said, "Mr. Shore," he said, "I'm curious, have you found a way through the work of Share Our Strength and the anti-hunger and anti-poverty work that you do, have you found a way to help children and families without embarrassing them? And then another boy asked a similar kind of question, and he said, I'm curious if of the children and families you serve, do you get to see them and know them, and do they feel seen, or do they feel invisible to you? And I thought these were such really profound questions at any age, but particularly a sixth grader. And they really are questions that motivate a lot of our work at Share Our Strength in terms of how we try to create more transformational change rather than kind of Band-Aid individual change, how we try to change systems so that everybody is lifted up by it. And so what I thought I would do is just take a few minutes and give you a little bit of the background of what we've tried to do at Share Our Strength, a little bit of the background of how we started, how I think some of the lessons are applicable to whatever your interests in the kind of social change world are, and then just open it up to any questions or conversation you might want to have. I started Share Our Strength. I was actually out here. I lived out here in Denver in the 1980s, and after working for Senator Gary Hart from Colorado, who was senator here then, when he ran for president, there was an enormous famine in Ethiopia, and I wanted to do something about it. I thought about the work I was doing with Senator Hart, and I wanted to continue to do that, but ultimately decided I would create an organization to try to bring new resources to help individuals who are suffering this way. So we created an organization called Share Our Strength, and the idea was that everybody's got a strength to share. Everybody's got something that they can give. You don't have to just write a big check. You don't have to be a politician or work in a campaign. There's some special talent you have that can make a difference in the lives of others. And we started by organizing chefs and restaurateurs and others, thinking that people who made their livelihoods from feeding people would feel a connection to the issue of hunger. And we started organizing chefs to cook at food and wine events, to work with low-income families, to teach them. It was very hard at first, just in terms of how you start an organization, and I don't think the only way to do this is to start an organization. I'll tell you that, when we started, this was back in 1984, so we got an Apple Mac computer, which was a very large thing at those times. It was like this big, and we sent out 1,000 letters to chefs, and we got not one single letter back. We sent out another 1,000, and we got a letter from a very famous chef in Berkeley, California, named Alice Waters. She sent $500 with a note saying, let me know what I can do. And I called her up and I said, here's what you can do. You can sign the letters because nobody answers mine. And she did. And then we got 50 chefs and 100 chefs. Today we have about 20,000 chefs and restaurateurs that are involved with us, including a lot of the best chefs here in Denver. And we raised money and we gave it to other organizations who were fighting hunger. We gave it to food banks, we gave it to children's hospitals dealing with malnutrition, we gave it to organizations that were working on nutrition education. And we worked at this for a long time, but we weren't satisfied because the problem was still getting more and more severe. Today, hunger in this country is at extraordinarily high levels. We've got 43 million Americans who are on the food stamp program, which we now call SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. 43 million Americans, half of them are children. The Secretary of Agriculture, who oversees all these programs, Tom Vilsack, will tell you that of all the kids in America today, 1 out of 2 will be on food assistance at some point in their lifetime. So this is remarkably uncharted territory for our country. This is a place we've never been. We've also crossed a threshold in that 51% of our public school students, a majority for the first time in history, a majority of public school students now live below the poverty line. And you think about all of the issues that teachers are dealing with in a classroom and also dealing with the challenges that come in for kids who are living below poverty line. And we know more scientifically and technologically than we ever have before about how a child develops. Columbia University just released a report where they did magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs of children's brains, and then they just correlated them to family income. Children who live in families that have less than $25,000 a year in income have brains that are 6% smaller in their surface volume than kids who live in families above $150,000 in income. And it's mostly because of nutrition and stimulation and the opportunities that these kids have to grow healthy or not. So these are remarkable new things that we're learning about where we are in this country dealing with hunger and poverty. And you see it in lots of different ways. I was in Oakland, California just a couple weeks ago, and they have a school breakfast program there, and the teachers were telling me, we happened to be there on a Monday morning, they said, watch what happens this morning. It's unlike any other day of the week. Almost twice as many kids come in on Monday for school breakfast than they do Tuesday through Friday because they haven't eaten all weekend. And the teacher said, I could tell you just by watching which kids come here what's going on in their homes. So we know this is an issue, but we also know, and you know this intuitively, I wouldn't have to tell you another thing about hunger in America for you to know that it's a solvable problem. It makes no sense. Kids in this country are not hungry for reasons that kids around the rest of the world are hungry. It's not because of famine or war or drought. It's because of poverty and our failure to connect kids to anti-poverty programs. But we have no shortage of food. We enjoy it, all of us, in its abundance. We have no shortage of food and nutrition programs. We have school lunch and school breakfast and the food stamp program and all of these others. So it particularly makes no sense that children are hungry. And as we started to think about our work at Share Our Strength, as we started to grow from an organization that started with a $2,000 cash advance on my credit card, and then the first year raised $30,000, and the next year $100,000. Now we're at about $61 million a year in terms of what we raise and spend on hunger in this country. But about 7 or 8 years ago, what we were doing, the grants we were making, the work we were doing, was getting less and less satisfying because we didn't know if we were really changing anything in any permanent way. We didn't know if we were just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. We were feeding lots of people, and we were helping lots of people get access to food, but were we doing it in a systematic way? And we started to think about something that a writer named Jonathan Kozol talks about, which is picking battles that are big enough to matter but small enough to win. And I really love that kind of formula because, again, this is, I wouldn't know the first thing about how to solve what's going on in Syria. I wouldn't know how to solve the refugee crisis. I don't know how to solve climate change in ways that are politically acceptable. But big enough to matter but small enough to win. Childhood hunger in this country fits right in that bullseye. And so we felt that if we got very focused on ending childhood hunger, we could succeed at that. And we started to rally all of our supporters around that goal, and we started to grow accordingly. And the big opportunity, what we were scratching our heads about is, with so much food, with so many food programs, why are there so many kids hungry? And we realized there was a disconnect between the kids who needed these programs and their levels of participation. In fact, the first thing I did was I came to Colorado and I met with your current governor's predecessor, Governor Bill Ritter, who was a terrific guy, had worked in the Peace Corps on nutrition programs in Africa, really cared about this. And I said to him, do you realize that Colorado at the time ranked 47th lowest out of 50 states in the percentage of kids who were eligible for programs but were actually participating in them? So the one kind of set of numbers I'll give you is we've got 22 million kids in the country who are low income and who get a free or reduced price school lunch, and all 22 million are eligible for breakfast as well, but only 9 million of the 22 were getting it, even though it's bought and paid for all 22 million. And that was the same conversation I was having with Governor Ritter. 40% of your kids are not, or only 40% of your kids are participating, and all these other kids are being left out. And Governor Ritter said, well, first he said, well, what's that mean? And I said, well, it means, these kids are going to be compromised in terms of their nutrition, their educational ability, and so forth, but it also means that you're leaving about $150 million in Washington, D.C. that can only be used to buy milk from Colorado's dairy farms and bread from your bakers and supplies from your vendors to feed your kids. And he said, is this possibly true? And he looked at a staff person and they said, yes, I'm afraid that is. And he said, well, why did we need the guy in the blue blazer from Washington to tell us this? How did we not know this? And it was really, at that moment, it kind of crystallized for me the underlying political consideration here, because what's really going on is poor kids are not only vulnerable, but they're voiceless politically. Kids don't vote, they don't make campaign contributions, they don't have lobbyists, so they don't get into governors' offices. And I said politely to Governor Ritter, if it had been a defense contract for $150 million earmarked for Colorado, somebody would have gotten into your office before I did to make sure it was spent the way it should be. So that's really a kind of a core piece of all of this. There's all the logistical hurdles to getting kids food, but then there's the kind of the political considerations as well. But we know it's a solvable problem, and I'd say the 5 or 6 things that we've learned in doing this, because we've added 3 million kids to school breakfast in the last 3 years. We've added tens of thousands of summer meal sites. We've created after-school programs as well. There's 5 or 6 things we've learned that I think apply to almost any issue or organization that you might be interested in, whether it has anything to do with hunger or not. One has to do with just setting a big goal. We put a stake in the ground. We said we're going to end childhood hunger. Nobody had said that before. It was kind of almost an audacious thing for one organization to say, because it takes lots of other players. But we said we're going to hold ourselves accountable to ending childhood hunger. And that changed everything. Our stakeholders got very excited. They started to donate more money. We got very focused as an organization to spend money on that one specific thing, which gave it a lot more power. We also said that we're going to have to build our own capacity. And you don't find this in the nonprofit sector very often. But we said we're going to have to hire people. We're going to have to pay them really well. We're going to have to train them. We're going to have to make sure they have benefits. We're going to have to make sure they have everything they need so that they could build a career at Share Our Strength. Most people think that nonprofits or social enterprise is a kind of a career detour. We said, no, this can be a career builder. We're going to make sure that people can do this in a way that you can build a world-class organization. The third thing we did is we said, we're going to be a nonprofit that not only redistributes wealth and asks you to make a donation so we can give it somewhere else. We're going to create wealth. This is where social enterprise came in for us in a big way. We said we're going to actually be a nonprofit that earns money. We're going to think about nonprofit as a tax status, not a management philosophy. And so we got very focused on, are there companies who care about and market to and want to sell to these 20,000 chefs that I mentioned at the beginning, and who will pay us to help them do that? So we got to the point where Fiji Water pays us $500,000 a year to be the water of Share Our Strength, hoping that the restaurants in Cherry Creek will stock Fiji instead of Evian or Pellegrino. Williams-Sonoma pays us $1 million a year. Citi, which issues Visa cards, pays us $4 million a year to be the credit card of Share Our Strength. It used to be with American Express. So we realized we were really in a position of not just fighting for our share of the charitable pie, but making that pie grow. And that nonprofits, which you think of as redistributing wealth, could actually create wealth. And this became the heart of the social enterprise that we were trying to advance, because there were no strings attached to those dollars, which means we could spend them as strategically as we wanted, and we weren't competing with other organizations for them. So this notion of creating wealth was very liberating for us. The fourth thing that we realized was we had to be involved with public policy. We had to do advocacy work. We had to impact government. We had to leverage these government funds that I described that existed, and that could be a force multiplier. We maybe only could raise $60 million a year, but our $60 million could unlock more than $1 billion of federal money that was just sitting in Washington, that there was bipartisan support for it, that governors had not realized was even there for their kids, so that could be an important leverage point as well. And I'd say finally we realized that we had to move quickly. I would say probably one of the most important things that I've learned in this work is to don't wait. If you have an impulse that you want to create some change in the world, find a way to start acting on that. You don't have to wait until you get your degree. You don't have to wait until the mortgage is paid off. You don't have to wait until it stops raining. I learned this the hard way. I always think about something that Dr. Martin Luther King once said, which is in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is the thief of time, and the tide in the affairs of men does not remain at flood, it ebbs. Such a thing as being too late. And these were more than eloquent words to me, because we've always worked in Ethiopia. I mentioned the Ethiopian famine as being a catalyst for us. And when I was there, I'd met a young woman named Alima Dari. She was 13 years old. This was about the same age as my daughter at the time. Spoke flawless English. We'd been observing a classroom, and she came over to me, and we started to talk, and we ended up sending each other notes and photographs and being pen pals long distance. And about 2 years later, when on a trip that I couldn't go to, I asked one of my colleagues to deliver a letter that I'd written to Alima. And there's a colleague of mine named Chuck Schofield. I talk to him every day of the week, wherever we are in the world. And 2 days went by, and 4 days went by, and 8 days went by. And I hadn't heard from him, and he finally wrote me an email, and he said, "I hate like hell to tell you this, but Alima died from cerebral malaria. Share Strength has been trying to build a hospital next to her school, and we didn't get the hospital finished, and so they took her to another hospital 3 hours away in Addis Ababa, and by the time they got there, it was too late." Those same words that Dr. King had mentioned. And so I say this as a way of saying that, when you have an impulse, when you have a commitment to something, time does keep moving and things keep happening, and you don't have to wait to find some way to get involved and make a difference. These things actually impact individual lives, and lives impact families, and families impact communities. And you're in this very special position. There haven't been many generations, frankly. You're probably the first that doesn't necessarily have to choose when you come out of school, do I want to create wealth and be involved in business, which is an important and an honorable thing, or do I want to serve the public interest through social enterprise or nonprofit? You can actually create wealth to serve the public interest. It may be a different kind of wealth, this community wealth. It might not enrich individuals or corporations, but to be in the position to create that kind of community wealth and create change in a world, particularly when our politics is so divided, when Washington is so paralyzed, when there are so many things that you can get done as individuals, and you can see that impact and measure it and communicate it, there's probably not a more powerful time in recent history to be studying what you're studying, to be working on what you're working on, to be hopefully aspiring to create the kind of change that you want to change. So with that, let me open it up to any kind of questions or comments you might have about our work. I can ask you some if you don't ask me any, because I'm curious about how you're thinking about this work, but we can start off anywhere, including, yes? Yeah, it's a great question. We were really, we were kind of babes in the woods feeling our way. We didn't have a very clear plan in mind, but that we made the $2,000 last as long as it could. We started to reach out to chefs and others to ask them to participate. We started to develop a critical mass of them. And then some things happened partly by accident, partly by design. So the one thing we said when we started the organization was, as I was kind of referencing before, we don't want to just be redistributing wealth. We want to create wealth. We didn't even know what we meant, but we said, we're not going to take foundation money, we're not going to take government money, we're not going to do direct mail, we're not going to have a high donor program. We're going to find ways to earn money. And so that kind of opened the door to it. And then we started to ask chefs and restaurateurs to do food and wine benefits for us. And MasterCard came to us and they said, this would be great. We want to encourage restaurant goers to use their MasterCard. So we'd love to be the sponsor of this event. We'll pay you $35,000. Now, I hadn't even paid off the $2,000 cash advance, so it was like $35,000, of course. Yes, you're the sponsor. And literally a year later, 12 months later, Bon Appetit magazine, food magazine, came to us and said, this event, we were doing these events in about 20 cities, this event is perfect for us. Our advertisers are all about food, our customers love to read about restaurants. We'd like to sponsor it for $125,000. And so I was like, oh, it's not worth $35,000, it's worth $125,000. And then 12 months later, American Express came to us and they said, we know MasterCard bought this for $35,000 and Bon Appetit for $125,000. We'll pay you $400,000 a year. And I was like, oh, that's what it's worth, right? We had no idea. Like usually, market forces tell you go to sell a product or a service and market forces tell you can sell it at this price point and this is what people pay. We just didn't know, and that's, I think, part of what's so interesting about this whole field of social enterprise right now is, we're stepping into places where the markets have not succeeded. There's not a political market for feeding poor kids. Politicians don't succeed by doing that, or at least they don't their perception of themselves is not that they're not going to succeed. There's not an economic market. There's not companies that spring up to do that because you can't make a lot of money doing it. So nonprofits fill this market gap, but to the extent that you can actually use market forces and start to realize, as we did at Share Our Strength, and we created this, I mentioned this for-profit subsidiary called Community Wealth Partners, this consulting firm, we realized that most nonprofits, not just Share Our Strength, most nonprofits, in the course of pursuing their mission, they create some kind of asset. And that asset might have a marketplace value. You might be able to monetize it. And so we created this asset by cobbling together all of these chefs in one convenient place if you wanted to market to them. There were a couple other questions, yeah? Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So what's been the most rewarding experience working at Share Our Strength? I'd say, you know, on two levels. One is obviously seeing kids in large numbers get enrolled in programs that really do impact them. So you know, you can go to a school where they've instituted the school breakfast program, and you'll see kids whose attendance has improved, their test scores have improved, their tardiness has gone down, their visits to the nurse's office have gone down. So knowing that that's going to have a long-term educational impact. But I'd say the other is just empowering people to realize they can make a difference. So we work with 20,000 chefs, and the conversation I've probably had with 19,500 of them is them saying some version of, I never knew that I could, quote, make a difference just by being a chef. And so again, kind of creating those entry ways for people to do that has been important. And I think just changing people's minds about things. Why do you guys suppose that of the 22 million kids who get breakfast, only 9 million were getting lunch? What do you think was going on there? Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay, great question. So how do we react to these outside forces or obstacles to kids getting food? If the bus drivers are on strike, kids will get there by lunchtime, but they're not going to be there by breakfast time. And so that is a big part of the drop-off. For some kids, there was also the stigma attached to being the kids that went to the cafeteria early for breakfast. So somebody came up with an idea. It wasn't us, but we came up with the idea of scaling this good idea, of moving breakfast from the cafeteria to the first 10 minutes of first period. Breakfast in the classroom, breakfast after the bell, grab-and-go breakfast, called a lot of different things. It's a very simple idea. This program was, so our school nutrition programs were created in 1946 after generals and admirals came back from World War II, said our recruits by the end of the war were not strong enough. We need to make sure that our school kids are stronger and healthier. So they created school lunch and then school breakfast. But for 50 years it had been served one way in the cafeteria before school. When you move it to the first few minutes of first period, maybe it's the first 20 minutes, almost everybody that you can possibly think of objects and fights that strenuously. Give me some reasons why you think that is. Yeah.
I mean, definitely in my school lunch program had it during the first 10 minutes of the first period. It was definitely a distraction from the material in class.
Okay.
As well as,
Yeah, so how do we fix that problem of the food both maybe not being that appealing or healthy and being a distraction from teaching in the classroom? I'll come back to that. What were you going to suggest? Anybody else? Well, I think you've hit on the main points of what we faced and to the question of how we overcame it. So what we heard from teachers and the teachers union was our contract says we don't clean up spilled milk. Our union represents us, and they had the foresight to put that in the contract. Teachers don't have to clean up spilled foods. The janitors had a contract that said we don't clean up in the morning. We only pick up the trash in the afternoon. So the trash is going to have to sit there, and nobody wanted that. And the PTA said it's going to take away from instructional time to be feeding in the classroom. So we thought, we took this as a challenge. We thought we had to prove the point, and we said, let us try in 30 schools, a manageable number of schools. We tried this in Los Angeles first. It's been done lots of places, but we tried it in Los Angeles, and we said, we're going to basically flood the zone. We're going to pour volunteers into these classrooms. We're going to have a parent and one of our staff and one of our partners in each classroom. They're going to clean up the spills. When I was in Oakland just 2 weeks ago, as I mentioned, I sat in a kindergarten and a first grade classroom, and kindergartners and first graders, they don't spill their milk, a few of them once a week. They all spill their milk every single day. That's just the way their little hands work. Okay, so it's not an issue to be, dismissed. But we said, let us be in the classroom and make this work, and let us try to work with chefs and restaurateurs and others to try and bring in healthier, more nutritious food that's still within the federal government's reimbursement rate, because that's the gating factor. You have to serve breakfast for, I think, $1.24 a meal or something like that. And it was so successful that the superintendent of schools in Los Angeles, which is obviously very large, mandated it in all 670 LA County schools. And what they found was that they were actually adding to instructional time, because kids who weren't getting to school on time to go to the early enough to go to the cafeteria, if they were hungrier, they were getting to school on time and they were still going to the cafeteria instead of going to their first class. And they were drifting into their first class 15 or 20 minutes late. So by the end of the year, we had teachers telling us we'd added to the instructional time. So, kind of in the category of nothing succeeds like success, we just had to prove the point and overcome these objections. Today we have teachers who, were very skeptical, who are making videos for us telling their peers they should try this. I don't mean to suggest it's a panacea, but it's an interesting case study of how hard it is to change a culture and how just resistant people are to change. We had visitors come into Los Angeles from another school district, and they looked at what we were doing. They said, this is fabulous. We could tell it's great for the kids. We can never do it at our school because we have nicer carpets. And we're like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, our carpets are much nicer. If something spilled on our carpets, this wouldn't work. And, they were about the carpets. They were teachers who were thinking about carpets, not about kids. And so, how do you change that? But change is hard, and at the end of the day, it's incremental. But you do reach a tipping point, I think, and we're seeing that now with school breakfast, where enough schools have switched to breakfast in the classroom. As I mentioned, we've added 3 million kids to this program. That now other schools are feeling like, hey, why are we left behind? We've got to catch up. We've got to do this. So times change, and you can force that change a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So how do organizations get around these legal obstacles and challenges to feeding kids when you have to? I don't know as much about that particular example, but I can give you a related one that is even, probably sounds even more absurd. In the summertime, schools are closed. Public schools used to have summer school, but a lot of them don't now. So when they created the summer feeding program in 1974, they anticipated that kids would eat summer meals in summer school. Now those summer schools don't exist, and they created a thing called the congregate feeding rule that said kids have to eat together. Congregate, like in a congregation, they have to eat together. They can't eat separately, and they can't take the food home. So now, since there aren't summer schools, we do this. We set up sites in places like Boys and Girls Clubs, Parks and Recreations departments, church basements, what have you. In New York City, we feed kids in the summertime at the big municipal pools where all the kids come on a hot day. If they come at 11:30 and they're expecting their meal at noon and a terrible thunderstorm breaks out at 11:45, they have to throw away the food, not let the kids take the food as they're running for shelter back to their own home from the thunderstorm. They have to throw it away, or they get fined by the federal government. So that's a law, for example. That's a federal regulation that we're changing through law that will probably pass by this December when Congress comes back into session. So again, it sounds ridiculous, but nobody paid attention to it until somebody said, we've got to be a champion for these kids who everybody else is overlooking. Yes? Our biggest consistent challenges reaching our long-term goals as an organization, they're probably not where you think they are. They're not, some of them are related to money, some of them are related to talent. I think most of them are related to what I think of as failures of imagination, which is, we kind of aim too low, and in this sector where there's never enough money and there's never enough of what you need, that you tend to acclimate your thinking that way, and you say, well, 3 million kids got school breakfast this year, so next year maybe we can make it 3,100,000, and the year after that 200,000, and before you know it, 25 years have gone by and you haven't gotten as far as you want. So, kind of incremental thinking versus really transformational, and failure of imagination and failure to take the big leaps. People are going to talk to you in your careers and in college and grad school and your first jobs about how you should take risks and you should innovate, you should not be afraid to fail, we don't penalize failure here. That's great, but nobody likes to fail. If you're accomplished, if you've graduated from this school, you've probably had some reasonable amount of success in your life, at least enough to make you want to keep succeeding. And it's going to be hard to get you to take the risks that we need you to take. So that tends to be, the biggest issue for me is just how do we get people to think really big? The only thing I lose sleep over at night is, what if we're 100% successful, but we aim too low? And all of that energy went towards the wrong target. Money is important too, of course, but I think, relative to other organizations, we've had some pretty creative strategies for that. I'm interested, particularly because of where you are in your lives, about how you think about these corporate partnerships that I talked about. We have a lot of them, and corporations can be good to work with, or they can be difficult to work with, and some corporations have good reputations, some have not good. How do you think about that? How does that sound to you? What kind of issues would you pay attention to if you were trying to decide what was in the best interest of your organization? Anybody? Yeah.
I'm super excited by System Front, purely because I think going forward, there's a new thinking around this whole thing that...
Great. And in the furtherance of social enterprise, are there companies you would try to work with? Are there companies you would refuse to work with? How would you think about those types of partnerships?
I think it has to be, in order to work with a company, it would have to be a company necessary.
All right, so Walmart on one hand, SpaceX on the other. Pretty interesting. No, pretty interesting dichotomy. It really is. I mean, I think those are good boundaries. Anybody else have an opinion? And I'll throw out a hypothetical that you can help us think through. And Walmart is what reminded me of this. There's a company in Arkansas called Tyson Foods, which is a big beef and poultry producer, and it's a complicated company. A lot of our supporters, Tyson came to us and they wanted to work with Share Strength, and some of our supporters did not want to work with Tyson Foods. They environmentally, the poultry business is a very dirty business. It requires lots of water. Tyson had fair labor violations against them and so forth. They weren't paying people well. And so we had supporters that said they didn't want to work with them. And Tyson offered to give us $2 million. And so we initially said, no, we don't think this is the right fit for us. So that felt okay, although we hated to turn down $2 million. But then the CEO of the company, John Tyson, called me up, and here's where I want to know what you would do. John Tyson called me up. He said, would you come to Little Rock? And I went to Little Rock, and he said it like this, if I remember. He said, this used to be my daddy's company, and my daddy did a lot of bad things. And now it's my company, and I don't want to do as many bad things as my daddy did. I'm trying to do good things. He said, but we're still doing some bad ones. And we feel like if we had a partner like Share Strength sitting at the table with us, we'd probably do more good things than bad things. So would you reconsider? Go ahead. Okay, so you're going to kind of put it on a scale and weigh, and also try to use your leverage, if you have some, to influence their behavior. Yeah. Okay. So you want to see some proof of the authenticity of their commitment and their values. Yes.
Well, I see I can see it that a lot of companies who are like the company
Okay, so try to persuade them, try to be an example or a role model for them. Yes, please. It does. So and here's the next stage of what happened in this conversation. We ended up, after some protracted discussions and getting some assurances, working with them. And then about a year, maybe 2 years in, They closed a plant, a manufacturing plant in Manchester, New Hampshire, and laid off 500 workers. And our key supporter in Manchester called me up and he said, you know, this is the last straw. I didn't want you to be working with Tyson in the first place. Now they've laid off 500 workers. We're trying to feed children and families, and all these families are unemployed. So tell me what you're going to do about that. Now, what do you think we should have done at that point? Well, I asked him, I got lucky on this. I was on the board of the Timberland company for 11 years that makes the Timberland boots and apparel and so forth. And they're headquartered in New Hampshire. So I knew a lot about Timberland, and I knew a little bit about New Hampshire, and I said to Michael, our organizer there, I said, I understand you're upset with Tyson. Tell me a company that you think is a company you would want to work with, a really good socially responsible company. And he said, well, Timberland's based here, and they're one of the best socially responsible companies there is. I said, I totally agree with you. I said, but what if I told you that they've closed every one of their manufacturing plants in the United States in the last 5 years and laid off 1,300 workers, which they did. And they make all their shoes in China at the time, now parts of Central America. He said, oh, I didn't know that. He said, I guess the economics dictated that they do that. He said, I still think they're a good company. I only say this because for me it was a great lesson in these issues are not always as black and white as you'd want them to be. I think of Timberland as a really good company that made some decisions that were hurtful to people that if it was up to me, I might have, if it was up solely to me, I probably would have made them differently. And I think of Tyson as a company that, you know, did a lot of things I didn't agree with, but was trying to do some that we did agree with. So the takeaway for me was you almost have to look at these on a case-by-case basis. And I think at the end of the day, I think you had it right. You had it exactly right. There's some balancing act that you have to do. You don't want to be building the brand of a company that you know is intentionally doing harmful things. But if there is some authenticity to their commitment to change, and if it's going to do more good than harm, and you think about who your responsibility really runs to in terms of the kids and the families you serve, then you might have to do it. There are very few perfect and pure relationships. Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, we have not been involved with Fiji Water on that particular issue. There's other food waste organizations that we work with that are, and we feel like that's their core competence more than ours, and it's not that we don't care about the issue, that it's unimportant to us. It's just in an area where we had to focus on, like, what's the thing that we do best, and how do we support partners that do something else better than we do. We deferred to others on that. So, you know, I don't know substantively on the merits how that's unfolded or what Fiji's worked out with them. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
What areas of the U.S. have the most concentration of child hunger, and why that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. What areas of the United States have the greatest concentrations of child hunger and why? And they tend to be areas that have, I mean, you know, first I think you have to think of hunger as a symptom of poverty. And, you know, we always say that although poverty is complex and solving poverty is complex, feeding a child is not. We know how to do that even in places where there's deep poverty. But the places with the deepest poverty continue to be a lot of the southern states in the United States and some of the real inner city urban areas. So if you spend time in Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, if you spend time on the Rio Grande border anywhere from, you know, Texas, New Mexico, across, you see pockets of poverty where people are, you know, the economy has left them behind. When you think about such an interesting economic indicator, so there was the big recession in 2008. I mentioned that there's 43 million Americans on food stamps today. In 2008, that number was 26 million. And at that time, it was an all-time high at 26 million. It went up to 46 million as of last year, and now it's down to 43 million. But it hasn't gone back down to 26 million. The stock market has recovered, much of the economy has recovered, banks have recovered, autos have recovered. But I say this as a way of saying there's a group of people in the kind of the bottom quintile economically who don't get pulled along even when the economy improves, and our programs tend not to reach them. Yeah, it's a great question. So our focus is on childhood hunger, and do we do anything to support them after they're no longer children? And it's a great question because one of the most underserved populations in the country today when it comes to hunger are childless adults. So, if you've got a child, you're going to get a basic level of social services. If you're an adult without a child and you're very poor, you have very few options and very few programs that apply to you. There's a few things that we do. We have and here in Colorado is kind of our flagship for it. We have a nutrition education program called Cooking Matters, in which we work with low-income families, and it's mostly moms and dads, but particularly moms, on a whole variety of nutrition education, grocery shopping skills, reading a food label, reading a unit pricing label, a nutrition label, knowing something. If a chef teaches you to carve up a chicken, you can buy a chicken whole, which is $2 cheaper than buying chicken parts that have already been cut up for you at the store. So we work with lots of families on things like that so that they're in a better position to sustain themselves both nutritionally and economically. But it's really a relatively small part of what we do. Colorado is, out of the whole country, Colorado is where we do the most of it for a whole variety of reasons. But and we have this conversation. This conversation never goes away inside our offices at Share Our Strength. What about veterans who have served their country and who are now on, many of them are on the SNAP food stamp program, are struggling and are not getting services? What about seniors who are much better off than they used to be but are still suffering? What about other families or people who were once kids getting these programs but no longer? And it's a constant tug of war with us to really stay focused on where we think we can have the most good, not because when we're finished we'll pat ourselves on the back and go home, but because we think that if we actually do accomplish that, we'll have the credibility and the resources to go fight that next battle. Yes? Yeah, this is, to me, this is like the $64 million question. This is the toughest question that there is, because a lot of really smart people, even of the same political persuasion, disagree vehemently about what's effective when it comes to solving poverty, and we've tried lots of different things in this country. There's some things we know if we were willing to be more generous and pay higher taxes, there are programs that do help lift people out of poverty. There's the Earned Income Tax Credit, there's food stamps have lifted a lot of people, the SNAP program, out of poverty. But if we were really emphasizing job training and job placement and the educational benefits that people need to have, we'd probably have fewer people in poverty. There's not a consensus on how to do that, and there's not a kind of a politically appealing way to do that. So as much as hunger is a symptom of poverty, it's also to some degree a cause, because hungry kids don't learn well, hungry kids don't succeed. If kids are going to have a chance of breaking that cycle of poverty, there's at least one thing we know that they must have as a kind of a prerequisite, which is, a nutritious meal every day, if not 3 times a day. And so we've thought about it both ways. We know that it's not enough, but we also know that, these kids are not going to succeed on the poverty question without it. My hope is that as we're successful, we broaden into a deeper, kind of broader anti-poverty organization. But again, that's, if you had to ask me today, if you were that, if you had $500 million, what would you do on poverty? I couldn't get you that many people that would agree that the course I'd suggested was the one that would work. And the truth is, you have to do a lot of things. There's not a kind of a silver bullet. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, it's a really good question about the dichotomy between hunger and obesity. And most anti-hunger organizations feel threatened by that question because they feel like if you're going to focus on obesity, you're not going to focus as much on hunger. We have a different view. I think of hunger and obesity as opposite sides of the same coin, and they're almost both the consequence of families not having both the resources and the information they need to make the best choices. And so what you see is within a family, within a community, sometimes within the same child, hunger and malnutrition and obesity, because obesity is often a function of As we know, it's much cheaper to buy calories than to buy protein. So $5 will get you a lot more potato chips and Diet Cokes than it will get you, steak or chicken or something, more nutritious and higher protein. And so families tend to buy in volume that way. But they're the same issue. And our Cooking Matters program is, has a focus on obesity as well, because these are things that families are struggling with. Yes?
Along this topic, do you think that it is broad enough and it's not
Yeah. Well, I think that, the quality of school food, and I think somebody was talking about, being in school where it wasn't that appealing, and I've been to schools where you would not try to get more kids enrolled in the school breakfast program because the food looks so bad. But as a general rule, that is starting to improve as well. It's lagging behind, and in a triage, emergency room sense, we've felt, let's first get kids access to food, and then let's begin to improve the quality. So there's some businesses that have sprung up. One's called Revolution Foods. It works here in Colorado, but it's based in California, that works within the federal reimbursement rates to use a different model for cooking foods in kind of a hubbed commissary and then shipping them out, but they're better quality foods. There's a charter school that we've been to in Washington, D.C. that was actually started by an educator and a chef, and the chef was a woman who knew how to go out and buy produce in an economical way. She knew how to cook it in a healthy way, and so they've got really healthy food, and because she knows about the economics of purchasing food, they're doing it below the federal reimbursement rate. And so as we walked out, she kind of whispered in my ear, don't tell anybody, but we're making money from the school breakfast program, because they were actually selling under it. So I think there's ways to get there, but for the big systems, I think it's for an Aramark or for US Foods or for a Sodexo, you're talking about, and they want to, we actually partner with Sodexo, and they've been a very good partner in helping us think through how do we bring a new generation of food and food activists to this issue of childhood hunger. So the big systems obviously take longer to change than the individual schools, but they're getting there. There's somebody up there. Yeah, sure. Yes. The question is there a shift in the nonprofit sector? And I'd say a very big one. It doesn't reach everywhere in the nonprofit sector, but if you look at some of what you might think of as this generation's brand name nonprofits, whether it's a Teach for America or a City Year, Habitat for Humanity, lots of others. Yeah, I think they're first of all, they're recruiting from places they haven't recruited before. We have lots of MBAs. At Share Our Strength. We have lots of graduate students in public policy at Share Our Strength. We have lots of people that we've hired out of the for-profit sector, and we tend to, when we do lose people, which we do, we obviously have some turnover, we just as often lose people to the business community as to the nonprofit community. So it's actually not even enough for us to be competitive with other nonprofits, because that doesn't guarantee that we're not going to have one of our best people headhunted away by Hill and Knowlton or Citibank or whoever. So we have to be competitive in the real world, and I think it's changing in a big way. It takes a little bit of fortitude and kind of hanging on, because there is a lot of pressure about how can you justify that salary, or how can you justify this amount of money going towards salaries. But the people that we pay salaries are the people that are going into schools and getting thousands of kids at a time switched over to school breakfast. We don't have an assembly line that makes widgets or anything. We just have people that are dedicated to this particular conversion of schools to healthy food. So it's been well worth it. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Which county is it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's actually a really exciting trend, I think, picking up to address exactly this issue, and I think government is finally getting smarter about it. So there's a couple things. So in California, for example, they just decided that in about 10 counties, it's a pilot program, but in 10 counties, if you're enrolled in Medicaid, so that your child gets child health insurance, you're automatically enrolled in school breakfast. So there's a one-stop shopping mentality that is now developing. There's a program, it's kind of a clunky, Washington wonky kind of thing called community eligibility, but it says, and they're experimenting with this in a lot of states as well, that if a community has 70, or I think in this case it's 70% free or reduced price students, all of them are eligible, because what they're actually finding out is for everybody involved, it's actually more expensive, even for the state, to screen out what's usually just 5 or 10%, sometimes it's as high as 20 or 30%, to screen out the kids who are not eligible. It's actually much more economical to feed them all. And so anyhow, some of these one-stop shopping things are starting to take place, and they'll apply to SNAP benefits, they'll apply to school meals, they'll apply to Medicaid, they'll apply to a whole variety of benefits that families can get. There's a interesting a company called, I think it's called the Data Bank, and they're taking this from state to state. Sir.
So I was curious, you mentioned not being late and acting now as a piece of advice. What other advice would you give perhaps the 18-year-old really sure that these students can benefit from?
Well, I would give a lot of advice to the 18-year-old Billy Shore, more than we have time for here. But I think, I guess what I see a lot that is, and what a lot of times students will ask me is, do I need to get this experience? Like one of the things that comes up a lot is, would I be more valuable if I went and got for-profit experience first? And because of those skills, would those be more valuable in the nonprofit sector? There's lots of different questions like that. And my feeling is that you should go straight at what you want to do as soon as you can, and that your passion will get you there. I know that sounds a little simplistic, but I've seen lots of people who made the detour who never really came back to their original intention. To use this example, if they went to a business or a bank or whatever, and next thing you knew they had a mortgage and they had 2 kids, and it's like, well, I thought after 5 years I would make this change, and I'm still having that conversation with them 30 years later. So, when I got out of college, I wanted more than anything else to work on Capitol Hill, and the only person I wanted to work with, don't ask me why, was Senator Gary Hart from Colorado. This was in 1977, and I literally drove down to DC the next day, and I walked into Gary Hart's office, and they said they had nothing, and I walked in again the next day, and I walked in for about 6 or 7 weeks, and actually turned down a couple other jobs on Capitol Hill with members of the House, very low-level jobs, mind you. Finally, in Gary Hart's office, there was an intern whose job it was, before the internet, the mail came on Capitol Hill 5 times a day in these enormous carts and mail bags. And there was an intern there whose job was to slice open the letters. And I think he got paid literally $125 a month. And he wasn't allowed to take them out, read them, sort them, just slice them open. And that was my job. I got that job when he left. But then I moved up through a whole series of things. I ended up being Senator Hart's legislative director and political director. But I say that only as a way of saying I was much happier doing that because it was taking me to where I wanted to be than to have all these detours just to kind of get my ticket punched in ways that people think they need to. Sir? Yeah. Well, great question. I'd say, the bottom line for us is we really want to end childhood hunger, and our definition of that is making sure that every kid in this country gets 3 meals a day, whether they get it at home, whether they get it at school, whether they get it between some mix of the two, which a lot of them do. And that's something that you can actually measure and count. And we will stay on that. That means breakfast, that means summertime, that means weekends when the schools are closed. We'll stay on that until we succeed. It's our belief that, success at that, and I don't think it's 30 years away. I think that's like in our lifetime. I think I'm older than a lot of the staff at Share Our Strength because I've been there for 32 years, but I think if you started at Share Our Strength tomorrow, you would see that success, and it would be an incredible success within the next, 8 to 9 years. So I know even that sounds long, but that could happen. And then I think it enables us to do other things. So the question I have is, if I'm going to talk to Governor Bill Ritter, or if I'm going to meet with Governor Jerry Brown in California, which I did about 8 or 9 weeks ago, I only get in there once or twice. I'm lucky to get in there. So do I want to just talk to them about breakfast, or do I also want to talk about child health insurance? Do I also want to talk about the mentoring and tutoring that kids need? And, is that there's this whole kind of, how do we surround kids with the supports that they need? I think, our country has to really think hard about, are we willing to make some of these investments now for the return that comes later? Our political system is so out of whack that if you're in politics, you need to show results for what you're doing within 2 years. But the really big changes don't occur within 2 years. And so you have to make these investments that aren't going to pay off till the long term. And we know when we invest in kids this way, we get a great return. And so we've got to create more of a culture around that as well. Yes? Yeah, creating job programs for parents and families in poverty. No, I wish we were doing that. And again, it's this constant issue of focus, stick to the knitting, stay at what you're good at, versus try and do some of these other things. We get to it a little bit around the edges. I think because of our work at Share Strength, I got appointed to a congressional commission on hunger, and we put out a set of recommendations about states needing to do more. So for example, there's a big, and I'd love your opinion on this, there's a big controversy over whether if you're on food stamps on the SNAP program, should there be work requirements in exchange for getting your SNAP benefits? So there haven't been work requirements, but at a certain point you get moved off the program. And there's also a question about, should there be nutritional restrictions? Should you be able to use your SNAP dollars to buy whatever you want, or should you only be able to buy healthy foods? Every other nutritional program has nutritional standards, school lunch, school breakfast, and so forth. So we dealt with some of these things in this commission, but we basically said, at a minimum, states should specifically create targeted job opportunities and job placement and job training for SNAP recipients so that they have an option to get off the program. Even that was very controversial, if you can believe it. And many actually, and the politics of it were almost backwards. Many liberal Democrats came forward to us and said, boy, you can't support encouraging work. The Republicans own that idea now. So you're helping the Republicans if you say that we should help people get jobs. I was like, how could you not support helping people get jobs, right? Just everything is good about it for a family in terms of their wealth, their dignity, everything. So, but it's not the focus of what we do. Yeah.
Exactly how much you were worth. As you were growing and expanding the organization, my question is, what skills were you?
Yeah, so the question is, what skills did we learn or need to bring into the organization and learn about as we grew? And that's such an important question, because for us, we faced a big pivot point where we had to go out and find things that we didn't have, and that was very threatening to people inside the organization. So for example, when we started to do more corporate partnerships, we needed people with business experience. We needed people who'd worked in corporations and understood what a corporation is looking for. When we started to do more advocacy work with legislatures, we needed people who had experience in state government or in the federal government. And we basically had to say to our team of people, we love what you're doing, keep doing it, but you're gonna have to slide down and move over, and we're gonna bring some other people in here. And they might have different skills. They might have graduate degrees, and we might have to pay them more than we pay you, not because we don't love you or we love them more, but because the market values them more, and we can only attract them if we do that. So we tried to be fair. We tried to make sure there was equity. But we went through a whole series of very difficult change management by going out and getting the kind of skills that we and a lot of other nonprofits had never had before. And that just means working with different types of people than you've worked with. So that's I think making that commitment as an organization is a very important thing, and part of the challenge part of the leadership challenge is to help people adjust to that, give them time to adjust to it, make sure that they get what they need so that they can adjust to it without it being too tumultuous for them. Yes. Yeah. Well, so Ethiopia was our catalyst, and so we've always done a small percentage of our work has been international, and it tends to not have the same kind of strategic focus that our domestic work does. So I'd say internationally, we look for leaders that we have confidence in. We do the same thing domestically, but even more so internationally, if we really have confidence in your leadership, and we're not on the ground in Ethiopia or Haiti or Mexico or Vietnam or Cambodia, other places we've worked, and you've got a really good idea that we think is going to impact a lot of people. It might be a hospital, it might be a farmer's co-op so that they can get prices to a place where it's worth them farming and having jobs. It could be job training, it could be something related to child care that enables families to go to work because their children are taken care of, then we'll support that and we'll fund it. It's I would think of our model as kind of a 90-10 model, which is 90% of our resources go to our core strategy and 10% we use to do good things that we'll learn from that could affect our core strategy later on. But those are some examples. Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.